Hi, students. It's Dr. Kramer here with a little video since I can't be with you in person due to the ongoing ice situation. I hope that you are all staying dry and warm. Um, so, you should have by now gotten feedback on your thesis and outline. And for this Sunday, which is February 1st, I've asked you to submit, it says a partial draft. What I'm really wanting is one paragraph. Now, on the syllabus, it said that we were going to talk about introductions and body paragraphs. I've chosen to make a video to talk about introductions. And then if we see each other in class on Friday, then I'll talk about body paragraphs there. You can write either one for your submission on Sunday. Some students like to, get the first paragraph done, but introductions can be the hardest paragraphs to write. So if you find yourself struggling through this particular paragraph, then I suggest submitting a body paragraph for your assignment on Sunday night instead of an introduction. Okay. All that to say is this is a slideshow that I've got linked on week 3 module under additional resources so that you can refer to it on your own time. But sometimes it's easier to kind of listen and as I would have presented it in class. And I just want to note that you'll see it says visual or literary analysis essays. This type of info will work pretty well for either kind of essay, and really honestly for most academic essays with some tweaking. All right, let's go ahead and get started. All right, before you do anything else, you need to have a thesis. And so, right now, each of you should have a working thesis that you submitted with your outline. Now, if I saw issues with your thesis, I gave you some pointers on how to revise it. If you didn't submit your material, then just do your best here. But you really can't get started writing until you have at least a tentative thesis. Okay. So I've got a sample thesis here, and it's a visual analysis of the Taylor Swift music video Bejeweled. And so here's my example thesis. Although it retains some of the typical Cinderella fairy tale tropes from the Grimm brothers and the 1950 Disney animated film, Taylor Swift's music video Bejeweled rejects the romance narrative and embraces the liberating powers of female sexuality and personal agency. Okay, so that's the thesis that I'm working with for this hypothetical paper. Yours, of course, will apply to your own topic. All right. Now, in the past, you might have felt a little strange or cheesy when you were writing an introduction because you may have known that you needed to put the thesis in there and then, like, kind of give the reader some background information, but you weren't really sure, perhaps, what the purpose of that paragraph was. The purpose of the introduction paragraph is to build motivation for your thesis. In other words, you want to give the reader a reason to read, and you want to prepare the reader, who is an ignorant but intelligent reader, and by ignorant I mean just is not familiar with your work. You want them to be prepared to accept your thesis as reasonable so that as you go forward, explaining all your logic and reasoning and giving your examples, they'll be able to kind of plug those into their brain of, okay, that's what they're doing this for, and this makes sense, and this is a good evidence, etc. For this reason, I asked the students think of their introduction paragraph as having 4 parts. And I did not make this up. This is from a book called Style, The Basics of Clarity and Grace. It's a very famous college writing textbook that we don't use here, but that has a lot of valuable information in it. And so I like to kind of point students towards this method of creating an introduction because it works really nicely. The first thing that you're going to do in an introduction paragraph is to hook your reader in by grabbing their attention. If you were in speech in high school or have ever been in speech class before, you might have heard this called an attention getting device. More on this in just a moment. After your hook, you proceed to what's called shared context. That gives your reader enough information to understand what you're saying. Then you present a problem that your paper will solve. This will show why your argument is going to be important finally, you state your thesis as a solution to the problem. Okay, so that's a roadmap of where we're going here in the introduction paragraph. I'm now going to dive in to the specifics of what each of these sections means and what it might look like. All right, hooks. You want to draw the reader in some way. And there are 4 ways that I recommend. You're only going to pick one of them, otherwise, your whole introduction would be hooks. But see if you can kind of relate or one of these grabs your interest as a good way to start off your paper. One way would be to give an interesting fact or example. So I'm sticking with my Taylor Swift Bejeweled um, visual analysis thesis here. So one way I could begin a paragraph for that thesis would be to say something like this. In an interview with Jimmy Fallon, Taylor Swift reported that she had to create a PDF file to keep track of all the Easter eggs in her Bejeweled video. Okay. Now, because I went and found that information somewhere else and I didn't just naturally know it, I did have to cite it there. We can talk more about that if you choose to use this method. You certainly do not have to, but just see how I cited it there. And PARA period is short for paragraph. So that was a web resource. And so I just counted the paragraphs since it doesn't have a page number. So that's just an FYI. So an interesting fact or example is a great way to start. Another option is what's called an anecdote. And an anecdote is a small story. It could be personal, historical, from the news, or from a fiction piece like another film or a book, or it could be an anecdote from the work that you're looking at if you want. And these are small stories told for illustration purposes. All right, so here's what I used that was personal. In June 2023, my oldest daughter invited her sisters to Chicago, where she now lives, to attend Taylor Swift's Eras Tour. We spent time downtown the morning before the concert, and hours before the concert venue opened its doors, hardcore Swifties were swarming the streets of Chicago, bedecked with friendship bracelets and dressed up in costumes representing the various Taylor Swift eras. So that's my own little personal anecdote of seeing Swifties in the wild, if you will, in Chicago in the hours leading up to that huge concert. So that's another option. Interesting fact or example is one option, anecdote is another option, and I have 2 more that will also work nicely. A third option is to do what's called an epigraph. And an epigraph is a quote that you set off at the beginning of the paper. Now, these quotes should be provocative, meaning it should make your reader think, and it needs to have something to do with your thesis. So it's best not to just jump on brainyquotes.com and pick a random Nelson Mandela quote to stick in, unless your visual analysis is like closely tied with that in some way. You could pick some dialogue if you're doing a film scene from that scene, if you'd like, a lyric from the song, something the artist or director has said, etc. Again, if you are using something that you quoted, you'll need to cite it. Okay, so here's my example here. Now, the reason I put bejeweled in brackets is because originally in the quote, as I read it, it had a pronoun it there. So this says bejeweled in brackets just to show the reader what the it is a little twist on a Cinderella story created just for the fans who like certain things like glitter and Easter eggs and lots of little cameos. And you see Taylor Swift quoted in Travis, paragraph 3, as a citation. I can show you how to format your epigraph. It has a special formatting, but if this draws you in, feel free to use an epigraph. And then the fourth option that you can use that works really well is to pose a puzzling scenario. And then that gives you something to do right away because you can navigate your reader through solving it. So here's my puzzling scenario that could begin my intro if I was using that bejeweled thesis. What happens in a Cinderella story when the heroine ditches Prince Charming in favor of real estate? Okay, so immediately the reader is intrigued, wondering what's going on. Okay, so that's something you can do also. So again, to review, option 1, interesting fact or example. Option 2, anecdote, like a little story. Option 3 is an epigraph, which is a quote. And then option 4 is a puzzling scenario. I will say that these are popular with students. Just don't go overboard. Don't put like 5 questions all in a row. That's just too overwhelming. Really limit yourself here. Now, we do want to avoid the throwaway kind of hooks that really don't help your paper. Now, you may not believe me, but this paper is not actually going to be very long. You've got to write an introduction, you've got to write a conclusion, you've got to do a ton of visual analysis throughout each paragraph. And so you don't want to waste any space. And I'm going to talk about some of those space wasting intros that you may have done in the past. I know I have. Don't be embarrassed. These are kind of like clearing your throat, I feel like. Sometimes people have to write kind of a boring intro sentence like this just to get started. But if you find yourself writing one of these things, do kind of go back and reflect, and you can just take it out, and I will never have seen it. Okay. So, one strategy to avoid that's super common with students is the dawn of time introduction. For example, people have been telling Cinderella stories for centuries. Okay. Nothing insightful there. Very boring. Okay. We want to avoid this type of dawn of time introduction. Another type is a placeholder introduction that doesn't really say anything. Like this: there are a lot of versions of Cinderella out there. The reason that's not really helpful for my argument is that this is not a paper comparing and contrasting different versions of Cinderella. This is a paper looking to visually analyze how Taylor Swift used the Cinderella tropes in Bejeweled. So you see why this kind of intro is not doing me any favors. A book report introduction, also very common, also not very great to use, very ineffective. Like, it doesn't really matter when Taylor Swift was born here. Taylor Allison Swift was born on December 13th, 1989, because this isn't a paper about the artist and why being born in December and whatever that zodiac sign is has impact on their life. This is a paper visually analyzing a particular music video. So this is not a good strategy for us. And then this one is my least favorite, so please do not do it. The Webster's Dictionary definition. Here's an example. Webster's defines agency as, quote, action or intervention, especially such as to achieve a particular effect, close quote. All right, this is doing nothing. It's very trite and boring and cheesy, so please avoid the Webster's definition introduction. All right. Once you have one of those great hook strategies, either the interesting fact or example, the anecdote, the epigraph, or the puzzling situation, then it's very important that you go on to shared context. This shared context builds the information that will allow your reader, me, to accept the argument you give at the end of the paragraph. Some of you, I had to comment on your thesis and outline that I didn't even know what you were talking about. Do you see how disorienting that is for the reader? How can I understand an argument about something if I don't even know what that thing is? So early on in this paragraph, after you do the hook, you want to cite your main source that you will be using in that essay. And by cite, I just mean name it, tell me what kind of thing it is, who the director is, or who's in control of the artistic visuals that you see. That's very, very important. It's also nice if you give the year. If you know it, you can put that in parentheses. You want to give some background, but the background should not give away your thesis argument. So in my Bejeweled argument, if I was doing the shared context in my intro paragraph, I would probably talk about when it came out, what album it was from, who directed the music video, and I would say something about it being inspired by Disney's Cinderella and the Brothers Grimm version. And then I would give a summary of what happens in the music video without revealing my thesis. So I'm probably not going to say that Taylor Swift Cinderella chooses real estate at the end, but instead kind of talk through the various things that she's doing to kind of get a glow up or to get her hyped up for her big night at the ball, how she is being downtrodden by her evil stepsisters, etc. You want to aim for about 3 sentences here. So you're not giving a play by play for everything that happens, but like a general sense of what's going on in your video. Once you have done the shared context, you get into what's called the problem. This is probably the trickiest part of the intro and something that we'll definitely work on in revision if you don't quite get it the first time. You need to create a so what. which is a reason for the reader to accept your solution. Otherwise, you're just kind of describing something. And while that could be interesting, it's not crossed over into an argument. So you want to make your shared context that you just gave problematic. So in my Bejeweled example, I would say something like this. Swifties love to point out all the Easter eggs referring to which album Taylor will re-record next and explain the Cinderella narrative in terms of Taylor gaining control over her music catalog. However, the music video could also be read on an entirely different level as a metaphor for women gaining power over their lives in more general terms. So you see how I brought up the fact that, most Swifties are into the Easter eggs, that there's this huge narrative that many of Taylor Swift's music videos are about her kind of gaining artistic control over things that she already recorded, her masters. And I'm like, yeah, that's out there, but I want to say something else. That's where that however comes in. And you can really signal this problem clearly by this kind of a word grammatically, like however, the problem is that, but, etc. The problem section should be ideally 2 to 3 sentences long. And then finally, you're ready to put your thesis at the end of the intro paragraph. Okay. Your introduction has a purpose, you've built motivation, and I'm ready to be convinced. And my example thesis was, although it retains some of the typical Cinderella fairy tale tropes from the Grimm brothers and the 1950s Disney animated film, Taylor Swift's music video Bejeweled rejects the romance narrative and embraces the liberating powers of female sexuality and personal agency. Okay. So I think I haven't put it here. I think I wrote this intro paragraph all out, and so I'll look for that. And if I found it, I'll link it in the week 3 module, and also on my announcement that I have sent you. I will have linked it there. But putting it all together for the introduction, make sure you have a strong claim that is specific, debatable, and significant. Decide which of those 4 strategies you want to begin your paper with. If you want to roadmap your argument, which some of you have been doing, and that's kind of telling the main things that you're going to talk about, make sure you put that in a separate sentence. Otherwise, your thesis can get really bogged down. Consider writing your introduction last. Definitely as you go further along, I know that I often will write my introductions last just because they're the most difficult. It's kind of a weird paradox where to really write an effective introduction, you have to know what you've already said. And you have a good idea of what you're going to say because you have your outline and you have your thesis right now, but you don't know precisely how it's all going to come together. But just keep an open mind. And if you want to write the introduction first, just know that you may need to go back and adjust it a little bit to reflect what you actually put in your paper. The rest of this PowerPoint is about conclusions and how you extend the argument. In class, I'm going to worry about this on week 4. So you can skip ahead and look through here if you want, but that's not going to be a focus for us this week in class, the week of January 26th. All right. I hope you guys are doing well, and I hope to see you soon, hopefully Friday.